all very well to say that the American economy is doing very well, but the bodies are piling up. Where if you're just looking at GDP or GDP growth, you're denying this misery that's out there. Countries that have major drug epidemics, opium epidemics, opioid epidemics in general, are countries that have serious dysfunction to start with. Opioid epidemics are somewhat of an indication of a society that's coming apart. We essentially have no trade unions left in the private sector in the US, and they've been partly persecuted out of existence. The elite has not done a terrifically good job of running the world. One of the key issues of international politics, of course, is global warming, and I worry a great deal over that the same elites who've been running the world for the past 50 years in the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, and so on, if you let those people loose on global warming, it's going to be disaster. This is going to end in tears.
Where do you find pockets of optimism? Are you finding countries that are being able to manage these contradictions between growth and inequality today?
It's a really good question, and I should ask myself that.
There's a lot of economic optimism within India today, and that the next 20, 30 years might be India's best time. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you smart, insightful, big picture conversations on the intersection of technology, economics, geopolitics, and current affairs, and history. And today I'm delighted to have with us Professor Angus Deaton, who's the Dwight Eisenhower Professor of International Affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of almost 200 papers in professional journals and of 6 books. I won't mention all of them, but I'll mention at least 3 that I've managed to read over the last few years. One being The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality, which I believe came out in 2013. Of Economics in America, An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality, which I think is the most recent one Professor Deaton has written in 23. And one co-authored with Ann Case, called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, which came out in 2020 and was also a New York Times bestseller. Professor Deaton is a member of the National Academy of Sciences of the US, of the American Philosophical Society in Britain, a fellow of the British Academy, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And in 2015, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. I know there's a much longer bio and profile I could share, but hopefully that gives you a glimpse of the extremely distinguished career Professor Deaton has had. So we are delighted to have you with us here today. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Professor Deaton, one of the main reasons I wanted to have a conversation with you was that I think you started to question and challenge this idea that, even as I was an economics student at a liberal arts college in the US, I think I was also taught, and I think most economists or people who are trained in that kind of thinking have been taught to believe this idea that all that matters is GDP growth, and that this value that we prescribe to efficiency, right? And you've started to challenge that and also challenge the assumption that the questions of distribution will just get figured out as we go along on their own. And you've argued that even if that might have been true in the past, I think today it's reached a level where it's no longer acceptable, and that we have to listen, I think, as you have argued, more to the disenfranchised sections of society. So we'll get into a lot of these themes of inequality that you've raised. But I first wanted to start off with 2 of your more recent books. First, the Economics in America book that has recently come out, and then maybe we'll get to Deaths of Despair. But I wanted you to very briefly lay out the broad thesis in that book, The Economics in America, and then we can maybe dig into some of the specific arguments you've made in that book.
Well, there's a lot in that book, and it's not altogether, I'm not sure there's a thesis. I mean, there is a thesis in The Great Escape, and there's a thesis in Deaths of Despair, but part of the purpose of the latest book, Economics in America, is it's part memoir. It does not have a single equation or a single graph. I mean, it's written for a broad popular audience. And part of my purpose there was to talk about not just America, but also economics in America, including economists in America, and how America operates. So several of these pieces were originally written quite a long time ago and have been updated with contemporary events, brought into something like a coherent story, or at least that was the aim. The end of the book, however, does raise some questions that we might want to talk about, which is the extent to which the economics profession has played some role in the difficult position we find ourselves today, the United States in particular, but also to some extent in Europe, perhaps even in India, though I'll let you talk about that one.
And I think one of the key things that I noticed you arguing for the economics profession is to start to broaden its idea of what is what constitutes well-being of individuals and societies. So maybe you can tell us about that a little bit and why you feel that that broadening of the concept of well-being is critical at this particular junction in our history.
Right. Well, historically, economics has always been concerned with well-being much more broadly than just money. So this focus on efficiency, on GDP growth, and so on, is somewhat of a modern invention. And, it certainly has not been adopted by all economists. I mean, I've been a lifelong disciple of Amartya Sen, who spent much of his professional life telling us that you had to think about distribution, you had to think about poverty, you had to think about health, and you had to think about aspects of human well-being that were more than just how much money they were spending. So,
yeah, and the freedom to make choices.
Well, there's all that. So, the capability and all the rest of it. He, in a conversation that he and I and Tim Besley had a few years back, he traced the beginning of things going wrong to Lionel Robbins' definition of economics as the purpose of economics, and economics, what it was about, was essentially efficiency, the allocation of scarce resources among competing ends. And he contrasted that with, for instance, Arthur Cecil Pigu's definition of economics, which was much more about helping deal with poverty, for instance. And if you go back to all the classical writers from from Adam Smith through to Marx, through to Mill and so on, they were interested not just in how much people consumed, but in many other aspects of people's well-being. So I'm not promoting anything new. I'm promoting something old. And, Keynes was certainly very broad in his set of interests. So even were the people on, the right. I mean, Hayek was a philosopher. There's this wonderful quote of Hayek's who says, you don't want to pay too much attention to anyone who's just an economist. And indeed he says, I would dare to claim that if you leave them alone, they'll do a great deal of damage. And, Milton Friedman was a libertarian, as well as an economist, and he always connected up the two things. So by this narrow efficiency focus, our job is to treat the economy as an engine of some sort. We have to fix it. We have to get our screwdrivers out. We have to get our pipes and valves out and make the train run as quickly as possible is, a recent aberration. It's not something that's embedded in economics for 200 or 300 years. But the other part of this story that's very, very important to me is, the work that Ann Case and I did on Deaths of Despair, in which you're discovering that even though the economy is growing very well, these death rates are rising. And, in some sense, it's all very well to say the American economy is doing very well, but the bodies are piling up. And, if you're just looking at GDP or GDP growth, you're denying this misery that's out there among an enormous swathe of the population.
Yeah, and I want to get more into that as well, because I think there's some very stark images that you draw out in that book as well, right, with Anne. But staying on the efficiency point that you make, this obsession with efficiency that, of course, economists have, and as a result, often policymakers also tend to have. You mentioned that it might have been a recent aberration. Now, in my own book, The Great Tech Game, one of the things I did was I go back into history, and I associate this obsession with efficiency and scale of production maybe with the Industrial Revolution, right, where suddenly factories and industries start becoming obsessed with massive scale. Along with that comes economies of scale and efficiency. Is that your understanding as well? Is that the recency of this aberration, or do you attribute this emphasis on efficiency to other maybe historical trends or phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, I like that argument, and it makes sense to me. But, people like Keynes and Pigou were writing long after industrialization had happened. And, they had a very much broader view of human well-being than just the efficiency side of things. And even I guess you could trace a lot of Robbins back to Alfred Marshall, for instance, and that sort of view of things. So, that story certainly makes quite a bit of sense.
And what's the response been to this thesis that you've laid out for economists in the US, both policy circles as well as the broader set of economists? Of course, there are some who must have vehemently agreed with you, but I'm sure, and I've seen some videos of this, there are others who've maybe as equally vehemently disagreed with you.
I think that's right. And it's very divided. And I get an enormous number. I mean, of course, the people who write emails to me are, the people who like it. I'm sure I don't use social media because I value my mental stability to some extent. And of course, there's a lot of other things, and as is well known, I mean, Larry Summers took objection to it, and there's a YouTube video
I've seen that.
in which we debate some of these issues. It's clear, but it's a much wider division. It's not just me versus Larry Summers. It's a widening division, I think, within economics as a whole and within journalists too. For instance, if you read the Financial Times, which I like to do when I wake up first thing in the morning, they have journalists on both sides of each other who are sort of warring over, the Bidenomics, for example, and, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It'd be no surprise to you to know that I think it's a very good thing. But once again, I mean, the deaths of despair, the fact that you've got this 2/3 of the American population who does not have a college degree, whose life expectancy peaked in 2010 and has been going down ever since then, and who lost many more years of life during the pandemic than did people with BAs who, like you and me, could sit in front of our televisions and, talk to each other. And of course, before that, the financial crisis, which really, I think, revealed that the emperor had no clothes, to use the old phrase.
Yeah, and I've seen that chart also that you've included, and that gap in life expectancy between those who have a college education in the US and those who don't is almost as wide as 6 to 8 years now.
Yes. And it was only 2 years as late as 1990.
Yeah. No, so of course, I think there's a lot of evidence to say that disparity is increasing, and that, as you argue, that gives you almost more reason to not look at just the overall GDP numbers and growth numbers, but also look at distribution and look at those that are not maybe as enfranchised by this kind of GDP growth. But the question then to you becomes, right, that if you look at countries or regions like, let's say, Europe, or even a country like India, the welfare states that have been now in place, I would say, for the last 100 years as a response to the inequality that industrial capitalism had initially spawned, right? So I'm talking about pre-World War I era now. It seems to me that Europe had really adopted that idea of a welfare state a lot more than the US maybe did. And if you look at even a country like India, a developing country like India, now you can argue, whether certain governments have been more successful or less, but largely the mainstream discourse is that of inclusive growth, and that you cannot have a country like India, which is, again, various socioeconomic segments coexisting, pull apart too much, right? And so many governments try to be welfare states at the same time as they try and push economic growth, right? Even in a country like India. But Europe, of course, is, I think, in many ways the epitome of welfare states. Is your sense that what will require the US to adopt some of the arguments you make is to become more and more like the welfare states of Europe? Or is there a different path that the US would need to take?
Well, every country has to take its own path, and there are good reasons why, not good reasons, but reasons why the US never adopted the welfare states that we saw in, that we've seen in Europe and that are in place in Europe. A lot of it has got to do with race. And, the historians who look through that period where when Truman was president, they were trying to introduce, healthcare, a centralized system of healthcare. India, you have healthcare in the constitution. I mean, it's not clear that it's delivered, but nevertheless, there was a recognition of that. And in the U.S., there was enormous political power in the Senate and so on to the South. And the legislators from the South were not about to legislate for healthcare that would cover Black people. And, there are other stories and other parts of that, but that's always been very, very important. And those divisions, the sort of injection of race and racial animus into healthcare provision is still there in the U.S. Obviously in different forms, it changes over time, but it's still, I think, a great obstacle. And if you look at the huge fights over the American, the Obamacare, for example, and the racial animus that was stirred up by that, these issues have not really gone away. But there's more to it than that, I think. And Europe basically pays more tax than the US. And a simple way of thinking about it is they have a value-added tax on goods. We do not have that. That generates a lot of extra revenue, which pays for a welfare state. The US does not have a value-added tax. It would be very hard. The US is sort of set up so that state competition between states on taxes keeps taxes, sales taxes, basically. But also there's so I think that welfare state, the existence of that welfare state is and has been important in protecting Europeans from some of the worst things that have happened in the US. So I want to get that on the table. Incidentally, my own home country, Scotland, has a drug epidemic that's almost as severe as the US drug epidemic. So it can happen elsewhere. And in Scotland, too, it's very closely linked to deindustrialization and so on. So even with a welfare state, bad things can happen. The other thing that happened in Europe is that the pharma companies in Europe were not allowed to make huge profits by addicting large numbers of citizens of the country. And so, whereas in the US, the regulatory attempts to rein in Purdue Pharmaceutical or J&J and so on were subverted by lawmakers who were taking campaign contributions from those firms. So we have a campaign finance system here, which makes it very difficult to stop well-funded corporations from preying on citizens. I sometimes feel like the citizens of the U.S. are a large flock of sheep that are just waiting to be sheared by predatory corporations supported by the politicians that they've paid off. Now, I know you have some of these issues in India too, so those are not foreign. But, as someone who grew up in Britain, this sort of public corruption, it's not called corruption because it's legal in the U.S., did seem like a sort of stunning thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why the deaths of despair got ignited, especially the drug deaths, and why they went on for so long. But that said, it's also true that countries that have major drug epidemics, opium epidemics, opioid epidemics in general, are countries that have serious dysfunction to start with. So the history of the opium wars, in which India was heavily involved, but it was more a bunch of Scottish entrepreneurs who were some of the worst people. If the imperial kingdom in China had not been faltering, it would have been much, much harder for these ex-East India Company folks to dump opium on the Chinese people. And there are a number of historical episodes like that where opioid epidemics are somewhat of an indication of a society that's coming apart, which takes us back to our story about deaths of despair, that the U.S. is just not functioning for people who don't have a four-year college degree, which is 2/3 of the population.
Now, of course, America and the rest of the world, when it looks at America prides itself, I think, and maybe attributes its economic dynamism and a continued economic dynamism for the last, over a century to its corporations, right? And of course, not just its pharmaceutical corporations, but really its other corporations as well, right? Whether it's today big tech firms or in the past have been, its banks and its financial institutions and its oil and telecom, right? All of these big companies, right, are credited to be the engine of American economic growth.
I'm not sure that's generally true. I mean, I know that some people argue that most innovation happens in large firms. But, the standard story is one of, Bill Gates in his garage, or, Brin and what's his name in doing Google and so on. Those were not large corporations. They were just guys in garages, So part of the story is a lot of innovation is happening among small firms, among startups, and then they turn into big firms. And then if you follow through the Aghion type arguments, about creative destruction, this can come off the rails at some point when these corporations become very large and start preventing the next generation of small companies turning into large companies. And, there's now a raft of antitrust suits in the U.S. against Apple and Google in particular. The banks are an interesting one because the banks are, among the worst for the amount of money they spend on lobbying. And the same is true for big tech now. I mean, the whole of the trade union movement in the U.S. spends less on lobbying than Alphabet does. So, you've got a real problem there. And the bankers right now are in a big fight over being forced to hold more reserves. And I'm told there are huge posters at National Airport and at the train stations exhorting people to stop the regulators making them hold more reserves.
Yeah. And I think we already started to talk about it, but I think the piece I want to ask you about is, of course, what implications it has and your arguments have for the future of capitalism as well, right? I think you've written a piece, or at least I came across a piece where you talk about what's the matter with capitalism. And of course, you're not the only one who's questioning the form of capitalism that's been around now and how that must change, right? Especially in the given circumstances and this widening inequality we're seeing in the world. And that's now, of course, getting coupled with this movement against globalization as we've known it for the last 30 years as well. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you feel is the matter with capitalism and where American capitalism also in particular might be failing, as you've called it, the poor prognosis of American capitalism. So maybe capitalism in general, it's the issue with it, and with American capitalism in particular.
Yeah, well, we've talked about The Great Escape and about the new book, and it's not a surprise if you put those together that I changed my mind to some extent. That the globalization has clearly helped a large number of countries. Some countries at least do very well, though I think it's still in dispute as to how much globalization helped India. It helped China a great deal. India doesn't doesn't export anything like the share of its GDP that India does. But there are also other countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam and other places that have done very well from this. So, capitalism and globalization certainly have their success stories. And some of it is American specific, not entirely so, but there's this feeling, if we go back to the corporations again, one of the things, the fact that the banks arguably were responsible for the financial crisis and, bore very little consequences for doing that. I don't think any of those people ever went to jail, for instance. And so we're pretty much back where we were then. I worry a lot about addiction, and obviously opioids is the obvious example of addiction, but people are addicted to cell phones too. The gambling industry has successfully lobbied most state governments to legalize gambling in the state. Now you cannot watch sport on television in America without being incited to bet on it. And, this is affecting children and things too. We've legalized marijuana, which I think was a terrible idea. It would just get a whole new set of people addicted to yet a different drug. And addiction is something you really want to be very careful about, because it's sort of like something where supply creates its own demand. And the usual laws of market, the diminishing marginal utility doesn't really happen. And so you're opening up a gate for powerful corporations to wander in there and make a huge amount of money through addicting people in various ways. And some people see a lot of what's happening in American capitalism today to that. Now, of course, on top of that, you have the system of campaign finance, which makes it almost impossible to regulate these guys. And Europe has been much better at that. And some have argued, like my friend Thomas Philippon argues, that in Europe, the EU makes it easier to regulate because lobbying tends to take place at the country level. So if you have a supranational authority like the EU, it's harder to lobby them. So the German government will not be able to resist Volkswagen at home, but the EU, given that it has France and all these other places in there, can do a better job of resisting German car companies or other German companies for the whole of the EU. So that I think there is that effective power of corporations is weaker in Europe than it is in the US. I mean, I know, again, I haven't worked on India in detail for the last decade, but I know you have campaign finance problems there too, which, have been, people worry about those a great deal.
No, that's right. That's right. Of course, they've been in the news recently as well. And I think India is also trying to figure out what is the best way to finance campaigns, especially as India becomes a larger economy, the stakes get bigger, and so on and so forth. But it's almost, as you were making the argument about the European Union as a supranational body, it almost seemed to me that the US equivalent of that would be, and I've lived in DC and I've seen this in action, to almost banish the lobbyists from DC and tell them to go to all the state capitals, but not to have them in the federal government's vicinity.
They've done that already. It's a lot cheaper to buy a state legislature than it is to buy a federal legislature, and they have very small staffs and they don't have a huge amount of money. And many of them are sort of amateurs. They're not professional politicians. And getting them to pass something turns out in many cases to be a lot easier than getting the center to pass something. But, banning lobbyists or trying to ban lobbyists, we have this thing in America called the First Amendment, which says you can't do any of this. And, I grew up in Britain. We don't have a First Amendment. We don't have any constitution in Britain like that. And, we have anti-hate laws, hate speech laws, and we have, people are just not allowed to say just about anything. And I think there's a case to be made for that, too. I mean, I understand the case for freedom of speech, but, we're paying a very heavy price for it.
Yeah. The other interesting concept you've spoken about, and in the context of capitalism, and of course the rise of large corporations and the ultra-rich in our economies, is this concept of upward redistribution, right? Is that something you feel there's a way to get around anymore? Or is that now the default way our economies are likely to operate, where I think, as you've described it, that instead of redistributing the massive profits of large corporations or the ultra-rich being more heavily taxed, you're finding that these very entities are actually figuring out ways to get a little bit of wealth, or a few dollars each from the lower socioeconomic parts of society, and actually aggregating it up instead of disaggregating some of the profits. Is that now a default, you feel, or is there a way to get around it?
I'm not sure there is a way to get around it. I'm quite pessimistic about that, just because they're finding new ways to do more of it all the time. And in some sense, I'm not a libertarian, and I'm often at war with libertarians, but this is something in which libertarians, I think, have it right. I mean, they hate rent-seeking too. And, they see government as the source of a lot of the problem. And, seeing the American government in this stage of capitalism in America is not actually helping. to put it mildly, but it doesn't mean it can't. And eventually they turned around on the tobacco companies. They turned around on there's still public opinion has some effect, albeit sometimes a little too slowly and a little too late.
Yeah. The other interesting argument that I think you've made, and I've had Professor Darren Asimoglu also on our podcast earlier, is I think the point you've made about, and lobbying is sort of part of this, is the impact politics and power has on capitalism, right? And so I want to extend that actually to not just national politics and national power, but really geopolitics and this global competition over power now that we're seeing, especially between the US and China as the two large geopolitical competitors of our world today. How are you finding that the geopolitics of our world today is impacting capitalism, not just in the US, but also maybe other parts of the world?
If you go back in history, it was the geopolitics that seemed to affect domestic. And now I think of it as almost the other way around.
So when in history did you think that is the reverse?
Well, you had these breakdown. If you think of international relations had effects on domestic economies in lots of ways. I mean, through obviously, through trade, but also through wars, through all this sort of stuff. I miss him very much, but my colleague Bob Cohen, who used to be here, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs about a decade ago, in which he was arguing that the main determinants of international relations now were domestic issues, especially in the US, rather than seeing international relations as an autonomous force. And I found that a very helpful way of thinking about things. So, in The Great Escape, I talk a lot about foreign aid, for example, about trying to help other countries. And, I changed my mind in that in a pretty serious way, too, because I don't think you can simply neglect what's happening within the US. And you have this sort of liberal elite that says it's a very good idea to give aid. And we think about poor countries and we should give. But, we live in some sort of democracy. And if the large fraction of Americans don't want that to happen, I think it's very dangerous to ignore them. And I think we're seeing the backlash now of having ignored them for a very long time. And I guess you could tell the story in India too, that, the Congress party ignored, a large section of the population who's now sort of taking its revenge to some extent. And, so payback time. And yeah. I think that's an issue with immigration too. I mean, the elite in the United States has told ordinary people that immigration is good for them. They don't think that. And yet that doesn't turn them into racists or evil people or whatever. And what more is, we're at least pretending to live in a democracy, so they should get their say too. And it's also possible that the elite was wrong, that, immigration is a problem for American wages, especially at the bottom of the distribution. And I've come to think that too. So I do think, if you ignore domestic politics when you're thinking about international relations, you do risk this sort of backlash. And now domestic politics is sort of taking over international relations, because the relation between the US and China is all driven by angry people in the US.
No, that's right. I think many geopolitical experts and international relations experts over the last few months have been arguing that the biggest geopolitical risk of 2024 is, of course, the US election and its outcome, which I think, as you're rightly saying, will be determined a fair bit, if not predominantly, by domestic politics and this tussle between the elite and the rest, right? At least, presumably, the elite and the rest. And so the question then really becomes that on the domestic politics side, it seems that two forces have converged. One is that the rising competition with China, and these are both interlinked, I think, the rising competition with China and its geopolitical implications and its implications for US's continued leadership of the world has required policymakers to say, hey, listen, we will reshore, right? This idea of reshoring, this idea of an industrial policy coming back, this idea of putting trade barriers back up, maybe, right? And maybe friendshoring. It seems to be driven by the competition with China. That's one. But then at the same time, I think the Democratic Party also realizes that Donald Trump was very much, the rise of Donald Trump was very much attributed to the people that you've been calling the disenfranchised, right? And in many ways, the geopolitical competition and the domestic political battle has converged to give them it seems like a coherent policy of having, again, another industrial policy, having maybe some resistance to the model of globalization that we've lived with. Is that your sense as well, that we're likely to find a convergence within the US?
I agree with that, but I would add a few things into that. I mean, I think an important part of this is something we haven't really talked about, which is the loss of power by working people. And, I'd love to tell the story of in Britain in 1945, when the Attlee government came to power, 7 members of its cabinet had started their working lives in coal mines, So the country was being run by people who were not the intellectual or laboring elite in any sense at all. I mean, Ernest Bevin, who may have been Britain's greatest foreign secretary, was, the illegitimate child who grew up through the union movement as a barrow boy in Bristol and who took on Stalin and played a key role in forming NATO. So, and we've lost a lot of that, at least in Britain and in the US, where the so-called left parties like the Democrats, their members are more educated than the people on the right. And so you've got that. But also a big part of something that's important here are trade unions. We essentially have no trade unions left in the private sector in the US. And they've been partly persecuted out of existence. The change from manufacturing to services has not helped. So there's lots of forces going on there. But that was a mechanism whereby ordinary working people had some control over the working environment. I'm sure Duran talked about that too in terms of AI. And, if you have powerful unions, they're sitting at the table instead of being on the table, as it were, helping firms choose which direction to go and moderating that. And the literature on unions, which has sort of to some extent died away, they really did raise wages for their members. They raised wages for non-members too, because there was this sort of spillover effect. They they affected local technology and working conditions, because the government can't monitor everything that was going on. And they've played a powerful role in local working conditions. No doubt that was sometimes abused. They were very important socially in towns. Bob Putnam's bowling alone figure was bowling in Union Hall. I'm sure that Union Hall no longer exists. But that gave them power in cities, in states, and at the federal level in a way that they just don't have anymore. And part of that has been, right to work laws and laws that have been passed to restrict them, but also the technological change and, a lot of corruption in the unions and so on. But for me, that's a very important, having lost that meant that you've gone a long way from a trades union guy setting up NATO to what we have today.
Yeah. In your book, The Great Escape, and I want to, sort of shift our focus briefly to not just the US, but really the rest of the world as well. And I think in your book, The Great Escape, when you talk about the origins of inequality, of course, you tell this story, right, going back into history of how certain parts of the world, primarily, I think Western Europe and the US and countries like that, had experienced sustained progress. And we saw this, what economists also call the Great Divergence, right, where certain nations, particularly those who industrialized, one can argue early and fast, and denied, maybe in some cases, the industrialization of other countries, right, through colonialism, etc., had set up the stage for today's disproportionately unequal world, right? And now we're talking about not just divergence within nations, but we're really talking about divergence between nations. I've had, as I mentioned, Professor Asimoglu on the podcast. I've had another great guest, Professor Joel Moker from Northwestern, also on the podcast. And both of them, I've had a fairly in-depth conversation on what causes nations to succeed and what causes nations to fail. I wanted to ask your view. What causes nations to succeed, in your view?
Now, I hoped you were going to ask the other question, which
And
is
both,
what.
I think by corollary, like what causes nations to fail
No,
as
but
well.
having a communist government is a good way to fail. I think
That's
we've
right.
learned
That's right.
that. And or at least the sort of communist government they had in Russia and Cuba and North Korea. China's a more complicated case. I don't think people know the answer to that. We know a lot about what's actually happened, but the World Bank spends its whole life sort of saying, what are the recipes for economic growth? And we know some things to avoid, but we're not very good at saying, you probably have to invest more. Now, the latest fashion is people say, export-led growth is the only way to go. Well, that's not really true. I mean, and many of my friends like Jean-Draz and Amartya, argue that the poverty reduction in India, the growth in India had to do with other things like education and public services, And it's true that China did those first too, so you can make a pretty good case for that. And then all of this discussion depends on what you do about China, right? Because China is so huge and it's been so successful, now it's faltering. It's sort of like, it's very easy to have these discussions boil down to one country, and then maybe we'll spend a little bit of time in India and then we're done.
Of course, Professor Asimoglu argues that it's the institutions broadly defined. Professor Moka, if I was to distill down, I think what he said was it's countries that focus on knowledge, on accumulation of knowledge and creation of useful knowledge, as he terms it. In my own book, The Great Tech Game, if I might indulge you on that for a couple of minutes, my own thesis, again, with all humility, looking at the history of the world, again, now going by thousands of years, the way I build out my own thesis in my book, it's called The Great Tech Game, but I go back into, about 10,000, 12,000 years to say there have been great games or great eras in the past where different capabilities have determined who will become prosperous and who will not, which nations or regions will become prosperous, which will not. And I broadly define them as 5 or 6 large ones, right? And I'm sure I've missed a couple, but there's agriculture. So if you go back 10,000 years ago, countries or regions, rather at that time, which developed these river-based valley civilizations, figure out how to master irrigation and agriculture-related technology to increase agricultural productivity, seem to have done decently well back then. And then, of course, during the global trade era, or what I call the Great Trading Game, countries or regions that became trading hubs, right? You can think of Venice and Egypt and, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of South India, and various other parts on the, what I call the Silk Roads. These trading hubs and those that become great trading entrepots seem to have gotten the right, formula. And then, of course, during the colonization and industrialization era, I think, as you know better than I, countries that colonized, countries that industrialized faster, and then especially those that managed to do both, right? Use colonization and their control over colonies to fuel their industrialization really won. And then you have the capitalism game where, this idea of creative destruction and capitalism, as we've seen in Western Europe and the US, have really succeeded vis-a-vis other nations that have gone left behind. And I come to today's era, what I call the Great Tech Game, and I argue that really in the last maybe 100 years, but really in the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've seen technology and innovation the way we know it today, right, through the information revolution, etc., are determining who wins, who loses. So I would argue that more than anything else, the reasons why America, certain parts of Western Europe, but really not that much, but Southeast Asia, East Asian nations, increasingly China, and now I would say India, are mastering or adopting technology very rapidly, becoming embedded in technology ecosystems globally, using technology as the engine of economic growth. What Professor Joel Moker calls useful knowledge. I think those are the countries that are winning. Versus those countries that are losing seem to be countries that are not necessarily playing this great tech game, but are rather focused on what I would argue earlier games only. So I want to get your thoughts on this thesis and maybe where you might agree or disagree.
Well, I mean, I like all of these stories, and I love reading this stuff, and they all have parts of truth. Those are very different things from designing policy going ahead, which is, you know, these if you're trying to be the World Bank, which of course I'm not, and you're telling countries at different points and in different places what they ought to do. But, I'm skeptical of the technology because, the US has led this technology thing. I mean, Silicon Valley is, in some sense where it's all happening. And this is where the bodies are piling up in the streets. And, I just don't buy the story that technology is necessarily helpful. And I think everything is contingent. And there's also my friend Bob Allen, who tells yet a different story about these things happening.
Which
and I
is?
like that one too, which a lot of it is prices and technical change induced by price levels and by past history. So you get the Industrial Revolution in Britain because Britain had won the wars of empire, well before in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so Britons were rich. And so and they had coal, and the price of labor was too high. Now, Joel has a very different view, and I love Joel's stories too. I belong to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which I belong to the American Philosophical Society here. The American Philosophical Society's motto is useful knowledge. And, growing up in Scotland, we really did believe in useful knowledge. And, Benjamin Franklin, who set up the American Philosophical Society, took the long trip on a stagecoach to Edinburgh to meet the founders of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who were Smith and Hume, for instance. So you could tell all of these stories together. So I'm not in that game, and I leave that to braver souls like you or Joel or Duran, or and I'm not sure that it's super helpful going forward. But I do worry about these people who are very seriously left behind. And, that real wages for people without a college degree in the U.S., for men without a college degree in the U.S., are now lower than they were in 1972. That's not just a blip. It's 50 years. And those low wages combined with the technical change that is helping so many people, and combined with the trade that is helping so many other people in China and Bangladesh and so on, are destroying communities and making...
Within the US.
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, the deindustrialization is not just happening in rich countries. I know that too. I mean, it's very hard for many countries in Africa and even for India, but given the overwhelming need of the Chinese to export stuff, to develop manufacturing industry. So, I tend myself to read and enjoy these things rather than join any particular one of them. But just to come back to where we started, I think it's just a terrible mistake to focus on, the growth part of this story.
Yeah.
When really bad things are happening. And it's because we ignored these bad things happening that we've got Trump now, and that we've got, in the large constituencies that were ignored in India, brought you Modi for good or for bad. But the elite has not done a terrifically good job of running the world, I don't think.
Yeah. And of course, the story sounds, the levels of inequality, and I think the story you're telling, and the sound of caution that I think you're sounding, very rightly so, sounds very similar to me to pre-World War I Europe as well, where similarly rising levels of inequality then of course lead to massive backlash, right, in the form of social economic movements like the labor movement.
Yeah, you could think that. But let me just say, when we talk about inequality, for me, the inequality that's putting American capitalism at risk is this educational inequality, and the distinction between a sort of 1/3 that gets all the access to all the good jobs and all the political power, and the 2/3 that does
That
not.
doesn't.
And that's determining voting patterns. It's even overtaken race to some extent. So now African Americans with a BA look pretty much like whites with a BA. And the gap between them and African Americans without a BA is enormous. So that racial gap, which used to be one of the dominant things in American society, has been to a large extent replaced. Not entirely, they're still there, by a class gap.
And so let me ask you this. I think as we look at the rest of the world, and as you look at the rest of the world, where do you find, I see the sources of pessimism you have about America, of course. Where do you see, or where do you find pockets of optimism from your perspective in the rest of the world? Are you finding countries that are being able to manage these contradictions between growth and inequality today? Are you finding that there are pockets of optimism, at least in the world, that you look to?
It's a really good question, and I should ask myself that. Now that you've asked it of me, I will think about it. Because it's true, the pessimism seems to be spreading much more broadly than just America. So, but the story of a large number of people not having political power seems to be much more general than just America. I mean, the people who voted for Brexit, for instance, there's a whole set of stories about migration. Obviously, I mean, I tell you, someone who's very, very optimistic. I mean, people who buy tickets in India to be offloaded in Colombia and walk through the Darien Gap to get into the United States. That is optimism of a very high order. So, those people think they can make themselves a better future that way. And
I mean, there's a high level of optimism. To be honest, economic optimism, I would say, within India right now. Right, I think a few different trends are coming together. For example, one is, of course, the geopolitical alignment in our world is largely seeming to come together in India's favor. So there's a lot of focus that has shifted towards capital floating in India to India, more investors coming into India. Of course, India's growth rates seem to be, sustaining at a higher level vis-a-vis others. And to be honest, the domestic political conversation seems to be not as lopsided, maybe, as you're making it sound is happening in the US, that focusing and tailoring India's economic policy for the bottom half is still very much in the mainstream. How successful it is or will be, of course, remains to be seen. But there's a lot of economic optimism within India today that we have the right formula of capital today and talent and broad macroeconomic geopolitical trends in India's favor, and that the next 20, 30 years might be India's best time yet.
Well, I hope so. I'm not, I mean, as I said, it's a decade since I was involved in the wars over data in India, but I'm sure those wars have not gone away. So, I hear some of those echoes. You also have pretty serious divisions between North and South, which are not going to go away in a hurry. And, a lot of the technology, as I understand it, is in the South.
That's right.
And, there's a political issue there too, which is not going to go away in a hurry. But I don't want to get into that because I'm not well enough informed. But good luck to you. I mean, and it's true. I don't think it's that people here don't talk about those people, especially now. You mean the poor people and so on. But, a lot of the rhetoric here on the right, at least, has been that, the way letting the market rip will cure poverty. And I don't think that worked too well.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. As you've obviously seen and been an economist now for decades. You've seen the world economy, I think, both from the UK/Europe standpoint and now for the last 20, 30 years, obviously, being in the US from that standpoint as well. You've spent a lot of time, I think, working on places like India and other parts of the world. What's your sense on how, or what principles do you think in the international economic order, the way we've known it for the last 30, 40 years, what are some of those fundamental principles that, according to you, need to be changed? Right? How would you want to reorder the international economic order and the international economic philosophy that's out there today? Not to say that there's only one, but how would you want to see it move forward?
Well, I mean, one of the key issues of international politics, of course, is global warming. And I worry a great deal over that the same elites who've been running the world for the past 50 years, in the World Bank and the UN and the IMF and so on, if you let those people loose on global warming, it's going to be disaster.
Yeah.
Because they are completely detached from the majority of the population in Britain or the majority of the population in the US. And so this is going to end in tears. So when I read documents saying that where the U.S. we're going to transfer $1 trillion a year from the rich world to poor world to make this all work,
No, it's not happening.
It's not going to happen. And what's more is the attempt to make it happen is very, very dangerous. So, we might have individual countries in flames in an attempt to put out the flames in the world. So I'm very worried about that. And that does seem to be an issue that's not really very well resolved. And it's interesting that when the book came out, I was asked both by the IMF and the World Bank to go down there and talk about it. And, I said to the IMF, do you know what's in the book? Before you invite me to come and talk about it. And they said, well, that's exactly why we're asking you to come and talk about it. And in both places, I had very, very large and very sympathetic audiences. And I think that, the sort of stuff we've been talking about has to come home to them more than it has, which they're sitting in Washington, D.C., which is in danger of being pitchforked by angry people from the rest of the United States. And they can't just get on with their old business of cosmopolitanism and reallocating money around the world to try and relieve world poverty, because that ain't going to happen anymore.
Is your sense that these organizations like these multilateral development banks, IMF, World Bank, etc., these institutions that have come out of the Bretton Woods era, many people see this as a set of institutions that are driven by a US-led world order, and they seem antithetical to countries like China and their interests in the world, and they often frame like their incapacity to deal with today's challenges like climate change seem to be attributed to this division between the US and China in a way, and that these institutions seem to be aligned more towards the US. But now what you just said was slightly different, which is that maybe they're more prone to the domestic political interests of the US a lot more than maybe they are being shaped by the global geopolitical competition.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And I think, my audience was unrepentant but sympathetic, if you like, especially the fund is very good at entertaining wild ideas at the broadest base and maybe at the very top, but goes on doing what it's doing in the middle sort of idea. The bank has never had a particular line in some sense. And so everything flourishes there. And it's much more like, but nevertheless, someone in my audience at the bank said, I'd been criticizing what I like to call cosmopolitan prioritarianism, which is just this idea that we should rank everybody in the world and, irrespective of these ethically irrelevant national frontiers, as the philosophers like to call them, and, try to redistribute, in the way that we've been trying to do since the Second World War, or maybe forever, from rich to poor. And
no matter where they are. So I think, as you've outlined, you'd rather prioritize the poor in Bangladesh and Asia over the poor in the US.
Yeah.
That's the idea of cosmopolitan, like global cosmopolitan.
The poor in the US are not so poor compared with the poor in Ethiopia or somewhere, right? And, one of the high officials of the bank said, I'm proud to be a cosmopolitan prioritarian. And I said, well, that's what I always was too. But, when they come for you with the pitchforks, you better have a better argument than that, because you're spending their money. But it's true that the China-US thing, it's true that the US, will block things at both institutions that it feels threaten it. That doesn't mean they can't do a lot of other stuff that doesn't particularly threaten the US. And China is playing a very strange game. I mean, China tries very hard to maintain its status as a poor country. So it would like to dominate these organizations, but it can't really because it wants to be a poor country at the same time. And I don't know how you resolve that.
Well, their solution, one solution at least for them, seems to be to just create a set of parallel institutions.
Well, that's sort of what they've done.
Yeah.
Right. And that's perhaps a clever thing to do. And they've lent an enormous amount of money, particularly in Africa, and that has problems of its own too.
Yeah. The last question I want to have, I know we've taken up a lot of your time, but you've spoken about this idea of migration also, that migration might not have been the best thing for the US. And that again runs very contrary to, especially from outside of the US, one of the key strengths of the US that the whole world seems to be envious of is that it remains the magnet for the best talent in the world, right? And of course, with some of the best talent in the world comes other types of migrants as well. But you've said that international migration might not have been the best thing for the US, right? So as you now look forward, and especially if you look at demographic trends more broadly, and I was talking to someone called Hamish McRae from the UK, who's also spent a lot of time in the US, and he talks about these demographic trends in his book, The World in 2050. As you look at demographic trends in the future, where of course the population growth seems to be coming largely from Asia and Africa. Population seems to be
Africa. There's not much population growth in Asia anymore.
That's right, largely from Africa actually. And as you were mentioning, and as we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, Asia has been a big source of India, China, other countries have been a source of big migration into the US as well, versus the earlier era when it was largely Europeans going to the US. Tell me, how do you envision this idea that you've propagated that maybe international migration is not so good, and reconcile that with this longer-term demographic trend where the growth seems to not be happening in places like Africa, but there's massive growth in population? How will you reconcile this? These sort of
there's a lot of different things going on here, and we have to be a little bit careful. Yeah. I mean, the southern border of the United States is currently a mess, and it's not under control anymore. And it used to be that it was almost impossible to get from Latin America proper to the US because there's a big hole called the Darien Gap, and that gap seems to have been opened up. So there's suddenly hundreds of thousands of people coming who could not have come before, and that's causing a crisis. That's nothing really to do with the things you were talking about here. It's just a question that every country wants to have some control over its border, and that is broken down in the US. And it's to do with geopolitics in Latin America too, so that, for instance, many of these countries like Venezuela will not take back their own citizens who fled. So where is the US going to deport them to? Anyway, that's one issue. So let's leave that off the table for the moment. A really important thing about migrants is in terms of skill level, they tend to be bimodal. So if you think of most populations, there are a large number of people in the middle. It's like a bell-shaped curve. Among migrants, that's not true. So you've got very, very skilled people at one end and a lot of very unskilled people at the other end. Many of the unskilled people may be very talented because migrants tend to be people with a lot of get up and go sort of ideas. And also we have a long history, which you were talking about, of migrants. And remember, I'm a migrant. I'm an immigrant.
Yeah, that's part of the title of your book. That's right.
Yes, of migrants bringing great things to the US and to other countries too. So there's a long literature on technical innovation in the US by migrants and so on. And, most of Silicon Valley is run by Asians of one sort or another, right? Who are immigrants.
But by the way, my sense of those migrants also is that even the bimodal distribution that you were talking about, there's some first generation highly skilled migrants. And then even amongst the unskilled, let's say, end of that migrant spectrum, it seems to me that the second or third generations could very much be in the skilled bucket, even if the first generation.
That could be. It's a little bit hard to tell because you get this situation where, someone comes from Korea and is a doctor, but sets up in New Jersey as a roofer, and then has 6 kids, all of whom go to Harvard. So, you're a little bit mismeasuring the socioeconomic status at the beginning. But I wanted to say something else. The countries like Canada and Australia that are still keen to have more migrants
Yep,
basically only accept people at the top end.
that's true.
Right? So you need money. There's this old joke in Australia, which is they call their immigrants boat people because they say the first thing they do when they get to Australia is buy a boat. So they're not coming on boats; they're just rich people
Buying boats.
buying boats. And the fraction foreign born in Australia is something like 30%, and they would like it to be higher still. In the US, it's 15%. So the issue really here is, what does increasing unskilled migrants do, right? And that's the political fight. And it's also an econometric fight. So economists have argued that the even unskilled migration helps not just the people who are coming in, but the people who were there in the first place. And I've recently sort of joined the camp where I don't believe that's true anymore. I do think it lowers. I was joking the other night that economists believe that if you increase supply, prices go down unless the supply is of people, in which case they argue that the price does not go down. So, and I think there are historical episodes where when migration was blocked, people at the bottom did very well who would not have done so well had they been competing with migrants, especially the great migration of African Americans from the rural South into northern factories. There's a good deal of evidence that the factory owners would have preferred to have Serbs or Germans or whatever, and they turned to African Americans only as last resort when immigration was blocked, which in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was the case in the United States.
Yeah.
So I think that's an open question. And there's also this issue I was talking about before, which is, if the vast majority of Americans think that we should have less unskilled migration, we live in a democracy.
We've got to listen to them. But so if efficiency is no longer the principle that you advocate for the international economic order to be optimizing around, a free flow of the kind of globalization of goods and people that we've seen is again something that you don't advocate, then what are maybe the counter principles that you are advocating for?
Well, I mean, I think we haven't paid enough attention to social justice, and there is this quote of Keynes, which I use in the book, which is not as well known as it ought to be. He says the economic political problem of mankind boils down to three things, which is efficiency, social justice, and freedom or liberty. And, it's sort of like one of those trilemmas. You can't have all three of them at the same time. But I think we've struck a balance that doesn't work very well.
Yeah. No, great. This has been absolutely fascinating, Professor Deaton. Thanks for sharing such contrarian views. I think that's maybe missing in today's world. I think going against the grain and at least presenting those contrarian ideas, I think based on your years of, engagement with these issues as an economist and otherwise. So thanks for doing that. It sparked a lot of ideas, sparked a lot of thought. So I thank you for that. I like to end every podcast with two quick questions that hopefully are not as world-changing and society-changing and destiny-changing as the ones we've been discussing, which are very simple, I think, which is, one is recommendations for books, other than, of course, yours or mine, that you'd have for people listening to our podcast. That's one. And second would be recommendation for guests on the podcast as well.
Well, on books, gosh, I wasn't really expecting that. But
I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it, and I'll tell you this joke that I always say, that I have these conversations that are presumably big picture conversations, geopolitical conversations, often like fundamental economic conversations, and everyone I speak to doesn't seem to get stumped by any question other than this one.
Yeah, okay. So here's a couple of books. One is, I've noticed that I really like the books that change my mind. A lot of things are written sometimes about economics, by non-economists.
Of course.
So there's a terrific book by Elizabeth Berman, who's a sociologist, called Thinking Like an Economist. And it is an account of how efficiency took over Washington. And it's not vague like I've been talking about, but it goes back to the archives and looks at the documents and says how efficiency took over the American government. And a lot of it was like the Ford Corporation at the McNamara times. And then it came out of Harvard and MIT and so on. And the thing is, it came from the Democratic side, not the Republican side at all. And I think that's very important in thinking about what Democratic administrations have done, for this whole debate about neoliberalism sort of idea. And I liked Gary Gerstl's book about neoliberalism too, which I thought was pretty good.
I'm speaking to him next week. Yep.
Good. That's a good thing. And also there's a book by Nelson Lichtenstein called A Fabulous Failure, which is about the Clinton administration. And there are wonderful stories about how, Larry Summers got Joe Stiglitz fired from the World Bank, for instance, by threatening Wolfenson's Nobel Prize, things like that. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, no. So I'll look up those. Any books from Asia or other parts of the world that you found to be interesting views or contrapoints on, how capitalism and efficiency.
I like the Shokamodi's book about India, which I know has divided people in various ways. And he lives here now, so I but that's not really where my reading has been so much recently. One thing that's not a book is Orley Ashenfelter has this terrific podcast about the history of labor economics and industrial relations people, which comes out of Princeton, and it's called The Work Goes On. And
The Work Goes On, okay.
Work goes on, and the best of those, there's one with Ray Marshall, who's still alive, who was Carter's minister, or at least Secretary of Labor. And there's a wonderful story there about the fight for the minimum wage, which is just a really terrific thing. So that's what I'm reading.
No, great. And what about guests for the podcast that you'd recommend?
I'm trying to think. There's a bunch of interesting people. I don't know if you know my colleague Owen Zidar, Zidar.
No.
He's a young superstar who works on where wealth is and who are the richest people in America and so on. And he's done a lot of work along this sort of Raj Chetty type things of telling us. And it turns out these highly rewarded CEOs are not the most highly people at all. It's the rent seekers, the people who have doctors' practices or car dealerships who are protected by local political interests. I don't know if you know Suresh Naidu, who's at Columbia. In spite of his Indian name, he comes from Nova Scotia. And the Indians have taken over the world. I mean, that's of course another part of the story. He's along with Danny Roderick and my colleague Ilyana Kuchemko is sort of pushing a sort of left-wing agenda in economics, and he's reads everything. He's very, very interesting, and he'd be a wonderful person to talk to.
No, great. Those are all great recommendations. I'm going to look up the books as well as the potential guests you've recommended. Thank you so much for taking this time. I really appreciate it. It's a big honor to have you on the podcast, and thank you for taking the time again.
Well, thank you. The questions are great, and it's always, there's no guarantee when you get on one of these things that the person you're talking to will know about anything you've ever said. You've done your homework. So for that, many thanks.
Well, thank you so much.